For these 6 people, a scenic overlook represented what should have been a moment of beauty, reconciliation, or simple conversation. But in those final seconds before the fall, they discovered that the greatest danger wasn't the cliff edge. These are the stories of victims whose last moments reveal the darkest depths of human betrayal. It was April 14, 2015, and the morning sun cast dramatic shadows across the red sandstone cliffs of Zion National Park in Utah. Angel's Landing rose 1,488 feet above the Virgin River, its narrow ridge offering one of the most spectacular and dangerous hikes in America. The final half-mile required hikers to navigate a knife-edge trail with 1,000-foot drops on both sides, where chains bolted into the rock provided the only safety for those brave enough to attempt the treacherous passage. Rebecca Martinez adjusted her hiking boots as she followed her ex-boyfriend Michael along the narrow ridge, her heart pounding from both the physical exertion and the emotional weight of their conversation. At 28, the marketing executive had built a successful career through careful planning and attention to detail, but her personal life had been shattered 6 months earlier when she discovered Michael's betrayal. Their 2-year relationship had ended in bitter accusations and financial disputes that still haunted her daily life. The weekend hiking trip had been Michael's idea, presented as an opportunity to talk things through and potentially reconcile their relationship. Rebecca had been hesitant to agree, knowing that their breakup had involved more than just romantic differences. During their relationship, Michael had been secretly embezzling money from their shared business account, stealing over $30,000 that Rebecca had saved for expanding her consulting firm. Rebecca's discovery of the theft had led to explosive confrontations and threats of legal action. Michael had begged her not to involve the police, claiming he could repay the money if she gave him time. But Rebecca's trust had been completely shattered, and she'd been preparing to file charges when Michael suggested the hiking trip as a final attempt to resolve their disputes amicably. As they reached the most exposed section of Angel's Landing, with stunning views stretching for miles in every direction, Michael's demeanor began to change. The apologetic tone he'd maintained throughout their hike gave way to something more desperate and aggressive. Rebecca noticed his hands shaking as he pulled folded documents from his backpack, his voice taking on an edge she'd never heard before. Michael suddenly grabbed Rebecca's arm with surprising force, his fingers digging into her flesh as he demanded she sign the papers absolving him of the stolen money. The documents would legally prevent her from pursuing criminal charges or civil action, essentially allowing him to keep the $30,000 he'd stolen. Rebecca tried to pull away, shocked by his aggressive behavior and the realization that this entire trip had been a setup. The struggle began when Rebecca refused to sign and attempted to leave the narrow ridge. Michael's desperation exploded into violence as he grabbed her shoulders and shook her, screaming that she was going to ruin his life. Other hikers were out of sight around a bend in the trail, leaving Rebecca completely alone with a man whose mask of remorse had finally slipped away. In a moment of pure rage and panic, Michael pushed Rebecca forcefully toward the cliff edge. She lost her footing on the narrow sandstone ledge, her hiking boots unable to find purchase on the smooth rock surface. Rebecca's scream echoed off the canyon walls as she fell 1,000 feet down the sheer cliff face, her body striking rock outcroppings before disappearing into the canyon below. Michael immediately began shouting for help, his voice carrying across the canyon as he claimed Rebecca had slipped while taking photos. When other hikers arrived, they found him in apparent distress, pointing to where his girlfriend had accidentally fallen. His performance was convincing enough that initial responders treated the incident as a tragic accident. Park rangers recovered Rebecca's body several hours later, but inconsistencies in Michael's story raised suspicions among investigators. Security footage from the trailhead showed the couple arguing intensely before beginning their hike, while financial records revealed Michael's embezzlement and clear motive for murder. He was eventually convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 25 years in prison. It was September 8, 2016, and the early morning mist clung to the Columbia River Gorge, as two business partners prepared for what would be their final meeting. Multnomah Falls cascaded 620 feet down the basalt cliff face, creating a natural amphitheater where the sound of rushing water masked conversations from curious tourists. The scenic overlook provided the perfect location for private discussions, though few visitors arrived before sunrise to witness the falls in their morning glory. David Chen checked his phone one final time as he waited for Stephen at the designated meeting spot, his stomach churning with the knowledge of what he'd discovered about their failing startup company. At 42, the tech entrepreneur had built his reputation on trust and innovation, but his business partner's betrayal had shattered everything he'd worked to create. The evidence in his briefcase would destroy Stephen's career and likely send him to prison for corporate fraud. Their company had been hemorrhaging money for months, with investors growing increasingly concerned about missed milestones and financial irregularities. David had been working around the clock to identify the problems when he discovered that Stephen had been secretly selling company assets and intellectual property to competitors. The theft totaled over $2 million, money that Stephen had funneled into offshore accounts while their employees faced layoffs. David's discovery had led to sleepless nights and agonizing decisions about how to handle his partner's betrayal. Stephen had been his college roommate and best man at his wedding, making the theft feel like a personal violation that cut deeper than any business dispute. When David confronted Stephen with the evidence, his former friend had begged for time to make things right, suggesting they meet at Multnomah Falls to negotiate a solution. The meeting location should have been David's first warning that something was wrong. Stephen had chosen the remote overlook specifically because it would be deserted in the early morning hours, giving them privacy for what he claimed would be a frank discussion about their company's future. David had agreed, hoping that their friendship might salvage something from the wreckage of their business partnership. Stephen arrived looking haggard and desperate, his usual confident demeanor replaced by the hollow-eyed appearance of someone who hadn't slept in days. He immediately launched into a prepared speech about market pressures and temporary cash flow problems, trying to frame his theft as a necessary business decision rather than criminal fraud. David listened in growing disgust as his former friend attempted to justify stealing millions of dollars. When Stephen offered David a buyout that would require him to remain silent about the stolen assets, the conversation took a darker turn. David refused the offer and threatened to call the police immediately, pulling out his phone to contact authorities. Stephen's desperation exploded into panic as he realized his former partner couldn't be bought or intimidated into silence. The physical altercation began when David attempted to leave the meeting and contact authorities. Stephen grabbed his arm and spun him around, pleading desperately for more time to fix the situation. When David broke free and started walking toward his car, Stephen picked up a large rock from the trail and struck him in the head with devastating force. David collapsed unconscious from the blow, blood streaming from his skull as Stephen realized what he'd done. In a moment of pure panic, Stephen grabbed David's unconscious body and pushed it over the 620-foot cliff, watching in horror as his former friend disappeared into the mist below. He quickly staged the scene to look like an accidental fall and called 911, claiming he'd witnessed David slip while taking photos. Rescue teams found David's body at the base of the waterfall, but forensic evidence contradicted Stephen's version of events. Blood evidence and defensive wounds on both men indicated a violent struggle had occurred before the fall, while financial investigators uncovered Stephen's extensive fraud scheme. Stephen was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. It was July 22, 2014, and the afternoon sun blazed overhead as American tourists gathered along the famous chalk cliffs of Beachy Head in England. The 530-foot white cliffs offered spectacular views of the English Channel, though their beauty was overshadowed by a darker reputation as one of the world's most notorious suicide locations. The remote headland attracted visitors seeking dramatic photographs, but its isolation also made it perfect for those with more sinister intentions. Amanda Foster adjusted her camera settings as she posed near the cliff edge, trusting her husband Robert to capture the perfect vacation photo against the stunning backdrop. At 35, the insurance agent had worked hard to build their comfortable lifestyle, never suspecting that her success had made her a target for the man she'd promised to love and honor. Their romantic getaway to England was supposed to celebrate their 5th wedding anniversary, but Robert had been planning her death for months. Robert's gambling addiction had spiraled out of control over the past year, accumulating debts that threatened to destroy everything they'd built together. He'd been secretly borrowing against their home, maxing out credit cards, and even stealing from Amanda's retirement accounts to feed his compulsive betting. When his debts reached $500,000, Robert realized that Amanda's life insurance policy offered his only escape from financial ruin. The $2 million policy Robert had purchased just 6 months earlier was presented to Amanda as responsible financial planning for their future family. She'd signed the documents without suspicion, trusting her husband's explanation about protecting their assets. Robert had researched the location extensively, knowing that Beachy Head's reputation for suicides and accidents would provide perfect cover for his murderous plan. Amanda had no idea that their romantic vacation was actually a carefully orchestrated murder plot. Robert had chosen England specifically because the foreign location would complicate any investigation, while the cliff's notorious history would make her death seem like another tragic accident. He'd even practiced his emotional responses, preparing for the performance that would convince authorities of his innocence. As Amanda posed for photos near the cliff edge, Robert approached her from behind under the pretense of getting better camera angles. His hands shook as he raised the camera, knowing that the next few seconds would determine whether his plan succeeded or failed. Amanda smiled trustingly at her husband, completely unaware that she was looking at her killer. Robert suddenly grabbed Amanda's shoulders and pushed her forcefully over the edge before she could react or scream. She fell silently down the sheer white chalk cliff face, her body striking the rocks below with devastating force. Robert immediately began his rehearsed performance, screaming for help and claiming his wife had slipped while posing for photos. His call to emergency services seemed genuinely hysterical as he sobbed about losing his beloved wife in a tragic accident. British authorities initially treated Amanda's death as accidental, but Robert's behavior during questioning raised red flags among experienced investigators. He seemed more concerned about insurance claims than grieving, asking repeatedly about when he could file for benefits. Investigation revealed Robert's massive gambling debts and the recent life insurance policy, providing clear motive for murder. Forensic analysis of Amanda's injuries showed she'd been pushed rather than fallen accidentally, while financial records exposed Robert's desperate situation. He was extradited to the U.S., convicted of first-degree murder, and sentenced to life imprisonment. It was June 11, 2017, and the evening sun cast long shadows across the Palisades Interstate Park in New Jersey, where the Hudson River carved its path between towering cliffs. The scenic overlook offered breathtaking views of the river valley, but its 300-foot drop also made it a dangerous location for those seeking privacy. Few visitors remained in the park as darkness approached, creating the perfect setting for a confrontation that had been building for months. Maria Santos clutched her pepper spray as she waited for Carlos at their agreed meeting spot, her heart racing with fear and determination. At 31, the elementary school teacher had endured 2 years of escalating abuse from her boyfriend, suffering physical violence that had grown worse with each passing month. The restraining order she'd filed against Carlos was supposed to protect her, but his continued stalking had made her realize that legal documents couldn't stop a man determined to control her. Carlos had been calling and texting constantly despite the restraining order, begging Maria to give their relationship another chance. His messages alternated between desperate apologies and veiled threats, creating a psychological campaign designed to wear down her resolve. When he suggested meeting at the scenic overlook to talk one last time before she moved away, Maria reluctantly agreed, hoping to end their toxic relationship peacefully. Maria's friends and family had begged her not to meet with Carlos, knowing that his violence had been escalating in recent months. The bruises on her arms and the black eyes she'd tried to hide with makeup told the story of a man whose control was slipping away. But Maria felt trapped between her fear of Carlos and her hope that she could somehow reason with him one final time. The meeting location should have been another warning sign that Carlos's intentions weren't peaceful. The remote overlook would be deserted in the evening hours, giving him the privacy he needed for whatever he was planning. Maria brought pepper spray and told her sister about the meeting, but she underestimated the depth of Carlos's desperation and rage. Carlos initially seemed calm and apologetic when he arrived, his demeanor completely different from the violent man who'd been terrorizing her for months. He spoke softly about their good times together and begged Maria to reconsider leaving him. His performance was so convincing that Maria began to relax, thinking that maybe he'd finally accepted their breakup. When Maria firmly refused to reconcile and started to leave the meeting, Carlos's mask slipped away completely. His calm demeanor exploded into the rage she knew so well, his hands grabbing her violently as he screamed that she belonged to him. Maria attempted to use her pepper spray, but Carlos had anticipated her defense and knocked the canister from her hands during their struggle. The violence escalated quickly as Carlos's control completely snapped. In his rage, he lifted Maria's 120-pound frame and threw her over the 300-foot cliff edge into the Hudson River below. Her scream echoed off the canyon walls as she fell, but no one was close enough to hear her final moments. Carlos immediately fled the scene, leaving no witnesses to his brutal murder. Maria's body was discovered by boaters the following morning, while Carlos was identified as the prime suspect due to the restraining order and documented history of domestic violence. A massive manhunt ensued, with Carlos eventually captured 3 states away trying to flee to Mexico. He was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. It was November 3rd, 2013, and the autumn wind whipped across Lookout Mountain in Tennessee as storm clouds gathered over the valley below. The mountain's famous overlook offered panoramic views stretching for miles, but its 1,200-foot drop also made it a dangerous location for clandestine meetings. Few tourists braved the cold evening air, creating the perfect setting for a drug deal that would end in murder. Tyler Johnson checked his phone nervously as he waited for Marcus at the remote overlook, his stomach churning with the knowledge that he owed his supplier over $15,000 for drugs that had been stolen from his apartment. At 26, the college student had gotten involved in selling drugs to pay for tuition and living expenses, but a break-in had left him owing money he didn't have. Marcus's threats against Tyler and his family had grown increasingly violent, making this meeting feel like his last chance to avoid disaster. The drug debt had started small, but Marcus's interest rates and penalties had caused it to balloon beyond Tyler's ability to pay. When thieves had broken into Tyler's apartment and stolen his entire drug inventory, Marcus had held Tyler responsible for the loss. The supplier's reputation for violence was well known among local dealers, with rumors of beatings and disappearances serving as warnings to those who crossed him. Tyler had managed to scrape together $2,000 in cash, hoping to convince Marcus to accept partial payment and give him more time to raise the remaining money. His parents had no idea about his drug dealing, and Tyler was desperate to keep them from learning about his dangerous lifestyle. The meeting at Lookout Mountain was supposed to be a negotiation, but Tyler's growing fear suggested that Marcus had other plans. Marcus arrived with 2 associates, immediately making it clear that this wasn't a negotiation, but a collection. The 3 men surrounded Tyler as Marcus demanded the full $15,000, his voice carrying the threat of violence that had made him feared throughout the local drug trade. When Tyler explained he only had $2,000, Marcus's expression turned deadly. The beating began immediately as Marcus and his associates took turns hitting Tyler, their fists and feet delivering punishment for his failure to pay. Tyler tried to run when he saw an opening, but the men caught him at the cliff edge overlooking the Tennessee Valley. With nowhere left to flee, Tyler begged for mercy as Marcus grabbed him by the shirt. Marcus and his associates lifted Tyler's battered body and threw him over the 1,200-foot cliff as a message to other debtors who might consider defaulting on their payments. They watched Tyler's body disappear into the darkness below before quickly leaving the scene, believing his death would be attributed to suicide or an accidental fall. Tyler's body was discovered by hikers the next morning, while phone records revealed his final communications with Marcus about the debt meeting. Marcus and his accomplices were eventually arrested, convicted of second-degree murder, and sentenced to 20 to 30 years in prison. It was August 17, 2018, and the late afternoon sun filtered through the mountain mist surrounding Grandfather Mountain in North Carolina. The mile-high swinging bridge offered spectacular views from its 5,305-foot elevation, though its 228-foot span across a rocky chasm also created a perfect opportunity for those with murderous intentions. Few visitors remained on the mountain as evening approached, providing the privacy that Gary Whitman needed for his carefully planned crime. Eleanor Whitman smiled as she walked across the famous bridge with her nephew, enjoying what she thought would be a pleasant family outing to their favorite mountain overlook. At 67, the retired librarian had no idea that Gary was planning to kill her for changing her will, leaving her $3 million estate to charity instead of family. The wealthy widow trusted Gary completely, never suspecting that his recent financial troubles had made her a target for murder. Gary had been counting on Eleanor's inheritance to pay off massive business debts that threatened to destroy his construction company. When Eleanor casually mentioned during a family dinner that she'd changed her will to benefit charity, Gary's world collapsed. His company owed over $2 million to creditors, and Eleanor's inheritance had been his only hope of avoiding bankruptcy and potential criminal charges for financial fraud. The scenic drive to Grandfather Mountain had been Gary's idea, presented as a nostalgic trip to the Overlook, where their family had shared countless memories over the years. Eleanor was delighted by her nephew's sudden interest in family traditions, never suspecting that Gary had spent weeks planning her murder. He'd researched the bridge's safety features and visitor patterns, choosing the perfect time and location for his crime. At the mile-high swinging bridge overlook, Gary initially engaged Eleanor in nostalgic conversation about family memories, his voice warm and affectionate, as he recalled childhood visits to the mountain. He gradually steered the conversation toward her will and estate planning, probing for information about her final decisions. Eleanor spoke proudly about her charitable donations, explaining how she wanted her money to help underprivileged children receive education. When Eleanor confirmed she had left everything to charity, Gary's demeanor changed dramatically. The loving nephew disappeared, replaced by a desperate man whose financial survival depended on his elderly aunt's death. Without warning, Gary grabbed Eleanor's frail shoulders and pushed her over the bridge railing, sending her plummeting 80 feet to the rocks below. Gary immediately called 911, claiming Eleanor had suffered a dizzy spell and fallen accidentally. His emotional performance seemed genuine initially, but investigators noticed inconsistencies in his account. Security footage revealed Gary researching the bridge's safety features days before their visit, while financial records exposed his desperate situation and clear motive for murder. Gary was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison, with Eleanor's estate ultimately going to charity as she had intended. Her death became a stark reminder that family bonds offer no protection against greed and desperation. Thanks for watching. Just when you think you know someone well enough to trust them with your life, click the next video for more stories that will leave you questioning whether anyone can truly be trusted.